Good evening, welcome. My name's Stuart Green and I was until very recently the head of the School of the Built Environment. On behalf of the University of Reading, I offer you a warm welcome to the second annual DEGW Foundation Lecture. It's almost exactly 1 year ago since the first DEGW Foundation Lecture delivered by John Worthington. Tonight I'm delighted to be able to introduce the second lecture of this series, to be presented by Despina Katsikakis. For more than 30 years, Despina has led innovation, research, and the implementation of transformative business environments with a particular focus on the workplace. Despina was previously chairman of DEGW from 2001 through to 2011, and thereafter progressed to an international leadership role in the global consultancy ACOM, which she left in 2012. More recently, Despina was appointed head of Occupier Business Performance at Cushman & Wakefield, where she provides input across the firm's global business on the rapidly changing context of work and its impact on employee engagement, productivity and well-being. During her career, Despina has advised some of the world's biggest companies, including Google, Unilever, BP, GSK and Microsoft, on how to achieve their business goals through the workplace. She has been instrumental in developing the vision and research to future-proof commercial developments around the world, most recently in the case of London's 22 Bishopgate development. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Despina Katsikakis.
Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction, Stuart. Thank you. It's a real honor to be here today, and I will desperately try not to do it, Theresa May, because I had no voice this morning. So bear with me, I have plenty of water and hopefully it will all go well. Doing a talk on the legacy of DHWs on the workplace is incredibly complex. The material is so broad and so deep that it's been very, very complicated to try and pull together a cohesive story. But I've tried to frame it in sort of 5 areas. I'm going to talk a little bit about background, about what the firm was about. I'll focus on what I think was core to the firm, which was forecasting the future and measuring value, then show some case studies, and finally I'll share some of my own thoughts on moving forward and how the legacy of DHW lives on. So DHW, a very interesting firm. We never could figure out whether to call it a business consultancy, a design consultancy, but certainly what we did always was focus on the changing nature of working and learning and its impact on people, place, process, and performance. And we coined this phrase called workplace strategy, which seems to have gained a lot of traction in recent years. Everyone I know is today a workplace strategist or growing those parts of their business. So certainly we touched a nerve there. And most importantly for me, the firm from its founding in '73 always looked to forecasting the future of work and delivering measurable business value by linking research, strategy, and design. I joined DHW in 1985, and I was there for 28 years. And people always ask me, gosh, how did you stay there for such a long time? And this diagram in many ways is the reason why I stayed there for so long. This tracks some of the research. I know it's practically impossible to read, but it's more for the archive's sake that I've put it up. It tracks a lot of the research that we did. And the important thing, I started right there with trading in 2 and 3 cities and 11 buildings compared in '84, '85. And every 3 years, we looked at something different. And every 3 or 4 years, that something different was actually evidence gathered through practice. So this wasn't just research, it was very much driven through client requirements. And those client requirements were fundamental in that they had a real deliverable, measurable outcome. It was very important that we have a global presence to be able to do that. Understanding global best practice was critical, and also following our clients around was essential. The firm had grown quite a lot around Europe in the 70s and 80s, and certainly when I took on leadership roles in the 90s, I was passionate that we should have a presence in North America, where a lot of our core corporate clients came from, and in Asia Pacific, where I believed a lot of the innovation and future demand was coming from. So we managed to really have an integrated global presence. And that presence continues today with the Strategy Plus business as part of the AECOM community of practice across over 150 countries around the world. The global presence was really important in being able to create long-term client relationships. I think what's unique about DEGW is that we didn't necessarily do one-off projects. Most of our relationships lasted decades with clients, and they were across every sector within commercial real estate. They were across government, education, cultural institutions, and a lot of urban decision makers. So we literally, I think John likes to use the term that we influenced from the chair to the city, and we did that throughout all of these relationships. And what was critical is that getting deep inside a client organization allowed us to really understand the user. And the user focus was fundamental to the firm. We always started by recognizing what the characteristics of the demand side of the equation were, what made a company successful, what was likely to change, and use that to inform the supply side. So the building was always responsive to very specific evidence and proof about demand. And what that meant was that it allows us to have very long relationships with developers and investors. And I always found it to be an interesting cycle, a cycle that those of you in the building industry will understand is not so directly linked. So when occupiers looked at the impact of technology in the workplace, it took developers about a decade to catch up with the building's typology and specification they were providing. Well, by that time, technology had left the building, and occupiers were starting to look at mobility, and then the typologies were starting to catch up again, and now we're looking at engagement and well-being. So that ongoing change has been critical. One of the ideally interesting aspects of this is that you would think that with developers it was more a one-off relationship, yet probably our longest client relationship was with Sir Stuart Lipton. I started working on the early research of Broadgate, but before that, Frank Duffy's Orbit research had caught his attention, and it became part of the brief for Finsbury Avenue. So at Broadgate, and then Stockley Park, and then in the late 90s, Chiswick, Paternoster, Central St. Giles, and Stuart mentioned that I'm currently working on 22 Bishopsgate. The learnings continue, and each time the question is, what is next? What is going to drive occupiers next? And interestingly enough, in 1985, one of the first projects I worked on was accommodating the changing city, which was looking at how the city users would change in the future, and that became the brief for Broadgate. Well, 30 years on, in 2015, Rob Harris and I did a new piece of research called Changing Work Styles for the City of London, and that became part of the brief for 22 Bishopsgate. So I think the legacy for DEGW for me is part of that continuing relationship. So where do we come in the procurement stage? I think it's really interesting. The first 5% of the expenditure of any project tends to be in the brief, but 85% is in the construction process. And for me, where DEGW has always added value has been in getting that phase right, because the consideration of options, the right project vision and program meant that we were able to manage risk and add value across the entire process itself. And that was always done through having robust tools and methods and a very comprehensive way of engaging users, both through empirical and subjective and objective data that allowed people to buy into the vision, to be part of the journey. At the same time, really clear, systematic methods to measure and compare buildings so that you were always making informed decisions about design, that evidence-based process. Or I studied architecture in Chicago, so we like to think of it as form follows function. And in this case, it was very much living that throughout the time. And last and not least, being able to start with the end in mind. So when we actually advise corporates, occupiers, trying to understand what the business goals were, then understand what the actual behaviors that would deliver those goals, and finally create the right physical and operational attributes that would drive behaviors and deliver those goals. Very, very important part of the process. So, forecasting the future. We're doing all that research because we want to understand what next. And I think it's important just to frame what's happened in that timeline of DEGW's research. So process changed dramatically. Technology transformed the way we worked. In 1954, the Rand Corporation expected that by 2004, we would all have this huge room in our houses for our personal computer. Well, by 2004, the computer was in our suitcase, in our pocket, and within 10 years, it has become ambient. It's everywhere. It's in the wearables, it's in the cloud. So that dramatic change was fundamental. People changed. The workforce changed significantly. Within this timeline, we've seen 4 generations come to the workplace. And whilst they might vary in some of their expectations, they are absolutely aligned in their demand for flexibility, of having choice of how, when, and where to work. And that poses important design criteria. And finally, place changed significantly. Very early on in the 90s, we began making assumptions that we expected these functions of life, living, working, learning, to blur. And we expected that traditional environments would be shifting to a network of virtual and physical places to support those various functions. And very importantly, we made the assumption that managing time would become far more important than managing space. As early as 1995, and I see you smiling, Andrew, Andrew Harrison and I traveled all over Asia with Arup and Northcroft to understand what intelligent buildings in Asia were all about and forecast what the future would look like. And we made this quite bold assumption that by 2005, the computer-integrated building, the intelligent building, would be only a part of a wider intelligent organizational network. And the power would sit in the knowledge networks, not in the buildings. That was a really interesting assumption at that time, because remember, in fact, that was right at the beginning of mobile phones. In fact, we were testing some of those huge rock-like mobile phones in Hong Kong when we were doing this study. The implications of that were quite significant. What that meant was that the impact on buildings and cities would be transformational. The knowledge network dependency would mean that people would use buildings much more intensely because they would be much more mobile. And they would actually be looking for a greater diversity of demand, therefore making building demand being simpler. So more intense, simpler buildings, but much more complex network of places. So the shift would be moving towards managing a distributed working network. And what that meant, and this was in 1996, the first time we mapped out a distributed real estate strategy that made the assumption that as we were becoming more reliant on technology, corporations, the enterprise, would not longer want to control all of the space they used. So it's very hard to see on that screen, but this is actually 50-50, that slide. And what this says is that about 50% of the space would be core space managed by the enterprise, and another 50% would be managed by others. It would be core, flexi, and on-demand space. And I think the growth of co-working environments today bears witness to the fact that I think we probably got that right quite early on. What it also meant, though, which begins to be very interesting for design, is that the nature of places change significantly when that happens. So as we begin to see space being used differently, the role of the office becomes much more a focus on collaboration. The office becomes a social condenser where the physical spaces are used intermittently, intensively, but actually they're much more engaging and memorable. So the function of design becomes much more important in this context because whilst virtual space is personal and convenient, physical space is somewhere you choose to go to have these memorable experiences. And we used as a reference for that the city because we felt that we could learn from the city in designing physical spaces that respond around patterns of human interaction, that they become much more overlapping, much more surprising, much more networked. And we're starting to see very, very different, more open-ended models of buildings in this context. Probably the first application of that was for the brief we did for British Airways Waterside in 1996. And the brief for this building was actually the British Airways Global Village. So the space was designed to be around a street with a market square, with a series of neighborhoods and home bases which would accommodate the different parts of British Airways. Automatically, this posed a real business case challenge. The board of British Airways couldn't figure out how to justify the cost of this glazed-in street. And I did a piece of work at the time which measured the amount of time British Airways executives spent traveling between buildings around Heathrow over a typical month. And the productive time cost of a typical month wasted going around to try and find people actually equated to the cost of the street. So suddenly we see something very interesting typologically here, because the role of circulation and core, which historically had been minimized for cost reduction and for increasing letting purposes, is suddenly reversed. So circulation becomes the opportunity for maximizing interconnectivity, for clustering amenities, a destination in its own right. And what you see in some of the images on the bottom is that a decade after the British Airways building, we see several examples where we apply this for Philips in India, for Westpac in Sydney, DCSF in London. So it had already become part of the design vocabulary. What that meant was that the office also needed to have a richer variety of work settings to support these new types of behaviors within it. And that fundamentally meant changing the ratio between individual space and shared space within core office buildings. So that same diagram of core, flexi, and just-in-time space that I showed earlier, this is 2000, investment banking division of Morgan Stanley at Canary Wharf. This was an absolutely seminal project because we were hired by the head of investment banking, not the real estate people, to help them transform the speed of an M&A transaction by using physical space and technology as a lever for different behavior and productivity. And this project was so important at the time that it was scheduled to be rolled out around all of Morgan Stanley's global real estate. But then tragically 9/11 happened, everything was put on hold. And ironically, I've been working with Morgan Stanley the last year or so, we're sort of going back and trying to investigate how we go back to some of those ideas. So the internal spaces of the office are becoming much more a place of choice. And similarly, the city is becoming a resource for work. Starbucks, at that time starting to boom around London, was a destination for work. The Hub had just opened near us in King's Cross, and new things like airport lounges, they were a new invention in that same period as well. And we had this concept in 1998 that basically thought about the office taking on the typology of the city, and the city beginning to become the same type of typology as the office. So the two, those urban metaphors working across both those elements. One of the most significant projects to build that vision was one of the first iconic projects we did in Australia. And this project, Campus MLC, I should preface that and say that our work in Australia started a few years earlier when Chris Alcock, who eventually became the managing director of DEGW in Australia, sent us a letter inviting us to participate in an architectural competition for Lend-Lease's offices in Australia Square, a very iconic building, which we won with him and his then firm, BVN. And we did a really interesting, one of the first activity-based workplaces. That became so popular that Lend-Lease started to use us for most of their work in the area. And MLC was a company that was part of the Lend-Lease investment umbrella. So they had this opportunity to reinvent an existing 1960s building in North Sydney. And working with BVN, we used this idea of a vertical village where these communal spaces, these urban metaphors, would be distributed along this vertical staircase that was carved into the building. The building was so successful, it transformed the culture of MLC. They started making enormous profit, and it was bought by National Australia Group. And as you see there, Peter Scott, the CEO at the time, actually says that the building becomes a physical embodiment of the transformation of the business into an innovative provider of investment solutions. Peter Scott then went on to National Australia Bank, and that led to a further journey of transformation across Australia, most notably in Melbourne, where NAB in Docklands was the direct follow-up project to MLC. then ANZ Center with Peter Andrew and Steve Costa, and very recently, James Calder, who originally set up our office in Australia, redid NAB's new building in Melbourne with this really interesting space called The Village, where National Australia Bank bring in their collaborators, investors, and the public to advise them and co-create on products. So what we learned in Australia was that this focus on creating good places for people, humane and social, user-focused design, could actually be very beneficial to the business. And it brought us into thinking more about communities and how buildings really should be driven around driving community. And probably the most important project that we implemented this in was Chiswick Park in 1999, where the buildings became very simple. Richard Rogers did a very basic, simple model of a chassis of a building. The focus was spent on the public realm, on the park, and for the first time ever, the developer provided an intranet, a way to connect the community and the whole ecosystem of Chiswick Park together. Remember, this is 1999, and we all see this as the norm today, but it was rather groundbreaking. And the brand that Wolf Olins came up with, which was Enjoy Work, was again something that resonates very strongly with the way we think about work today. But what Chiswick began to focus on is this expectation of higher levels of flexibility and service provision from landlords, which had never really happened before. Well, those were our ideas that we were informing clients with, but we then were able to validate them through a very significant piece of research that Andrew Harrison led for the European Commission, which was SANE, Sustainable Accommodation for the New Economy. And what SANE did was actually begin to map how the the technology world and the innovation that was happening could begin to create a new type of environment alongside physical spaces. So what we saw was this distribution of places that would be public, like the internet, our public squares, and Bryant Park in New York had just rolled out Wi-Fi in a public area, places that would be privileged and you had invited access, and places that would be quite private. And that, as a methodology of layering space, became a very, very important part of how we began to address space at DEGW. And I think one of the most significant projects that we did at the time was beginning to think about these new types of hybrid spaces. And this project was called Box in 2004. It was a joint venture between EDS and the London School of Economics to create a place that was a hybrid academic and commercial space to support key clients. Suddenly, these are the kind of environments that we are now, again, trying to create within developments and within cities to bring together the learnings from industry and academia and co-create and innovate. So very much, I think, a significant symbolic project. So that was a kind of whirlwind through the key ideas development. But when we talk about business transformation, you need to be able to measure the value. So how do you actually articulate what the value that each of those ideas have delivered? And back in 2000 at NeoCon in Chicago, Frank Duffy showed these two slides, which were very, very significant because they flagged one of the first times that whilst as an industry we were focusing a lot on space, space was only 10% of the operational expenditure. And if we wanted to make significant business impact, we needed to make the most of space and drive efficiency, but also make the most of people and drive effectiveness. And at DEGW, we were very passionate about looking at measurement along this balanced scorecard idea that began to look at how you can make the most of space, the most of people, use expression to demonstrate the brand and values of the organization, and drive your corporate social responsibility and environment. And these projects that, Cisco in 2006 being able to deliver 26% more headcount in the same amount of space was a very successful, efficient project. John spoke a lot last year about Boots and the whole cultural transformation around Boots. And of course, Terry Gunnery's iconic Google workplaces across Europe transformed the role of expression in space. And South Australia Water, the one on the bottom right, in Adelaide, was the first 6-star building in Australia to be delivered with no additional investment, and at the same time have a fully integrated world-class water lab and research facility within it. So a real blurring of conditions. I think when we started to go further into effectiveness, we became much more sophisticated in our metrics. We had a 10-year relationship with GlaxoSmithKline, and I'm glad to see that Davida is here today, who did a lot of that. And one of the really interesting projects with them, you have to understand that the context of scientists being able to look at measuring performance became a very interesting challenge for us because, of course, they wanted to develop the data and the metrics themselves. So we collaborated with our consumer healthcare teams to set up, in 2006, what was actually one of the first, today you would call it an agile collaboration lab, which brought together people across the different disciplines of consumer healthcare to co-create alongside one another. We measured a lot of the benefits, 67% decrease in time lost per day because you could find people, 45% faster decision maker, half the email value, everybody loved that. But more importantly, there was a really interesting magic kernel in this. By having scientists sitting alongside the people that actually were selling the products, they came up with interesting new ideas, like maybe the Nicorette patch could be pitched to women because stopping smoking makes your skin better. And lo and behold, that delivered a 50 million increase in sales just by that simple co-location collaboration. So the value began to be significantly different, and that became much more interesting for us. I showed Google, and DEGW is associated with Google because of its iconic value, but many of you will have heard me say that I consider Google in a way to be easy because you're starting from a blank sheet. What was far more interesting was the transformation of culture and brand at the BBC, where we worked from 1998 to 2008. And when we started, the BBC was super hierarchical. It had poor information management. It was chaotic, dispiriting. In fact, the first piece of work that I did was called Assessing the Hearts and Minds of the BBC Against Creativity. And the question was, where do you feel creative? And I had to stand up in front of John Burt, who was then Director General, and say, people feel creative everywhere except BBC property. So it's a bit of a problem when creative talent is really who you're trying to recruit. But that journey of transformation, again with Terry and the interiors team design into BBC Worldwide, where we went from a place that people didn't feel they wanted to even be in it, to a place where people felt proud to work there and they felt inspired. That, to me, was a really significant transformation journey in terms of using space for value. And AECOM continues that journey. National Grid is a project that's been going on for some time with incredible data. And in this case, in phase 1, they measured the real estate, energy, and collaboration issues. But in phase 2, they started getting much more granular and beginning to look at the value of cognitive performance increases. And in this case, an 8% cognitive performance increase means 20 million in salary costs. So that granularity of effectiveness, I think, is what brings high-performance workplaces. So I'm going to try and get my voice back. And just go through a little bit of how we applied research to practice. So I'm going to talk about a journey that starts with Steelcase and it moves into Accenture. 1991, Frank Duffy was asked to join a retreat in the mountains of Colorado by Jack Tanis, who at the time was head of strategy and future of Steelcase. And Frank, for my luck, was going to a family trip in Peru, so he asked me to step in his place. And I arrived in the middle of the mountains in what appeared to be a kind of all-male bonding session. So they were a bit thrown by that. But it was an incredible group of individuals. It was everyone that had some creative insight about the future of the workplace, brought together by Steelcase to think how they could re-engineer their business to get closer to customers, to understand their customers' business, and help them drive their performance and transform their business through space. And lo and behold, we reinvented in that process a diagram that Frank had originally started noting in his Princeton dissertation back in the 70s. And this diagram was really critical because we looked at the impact of autonomy and interaction on work patterns and began to classify different work patterns and how they began to represent that with technology. And what we established was that in 1991, the majority of spaces were designed to deliver routine process tasks. But what we said was that by actually a decade, we expected that the environments would shift into club-type environments where autonomy and interaction were the driving force, and that would transform the way the spaces were designed away from individual workstations with a few ancillary spaces into a whole variety of options of shared environments. Steelcase at the time were the global provider to Andersen, and in that same timeline, we were doing two very important parallel pieces of work. The first one on the left was the first ever time utilization study in 1989 for IBM salespeople, and that was done on paper and noting what people were doing when Davida is knowingly nodding her head. That piece of work was influential in creating the first applications of a flexible work environment for IBM salespeople. And it allowed us to do the second piece of work, which was for Andersen, the then global accounting firm, which was called the Global Real Estate Management System, which actually looked at how you could use utilization data and develop sharing ratios across different work styles in the business. Steelcase were Andersen's global furniture supplier. So they said, why don't we bring those two elements together and explore what we can do in their global headquarters in Chicago. So we moved into a program in Chicago where we literally created the first activity-based workplace. And the reason why I show these images is the image on the left is the Andersen CFO, John Lewis, who when I first went to see, I had to go through 2 reception rooms, 2 sets of secretaries. And when I walked into his office, he said, I want an environment that people spontaneously interact with each other. And I had to just burst out laughing. I said, are you kidding? I said, do you know what it took for me to come in here? And in fairness to him, what he said was, I'm willing to walk the talk. I want to know what I need to do to be able to give that message. And that's him sitting in one of his work settings, because he had access to a meeting room, to a quiet room around his space when we moved them. 30% less space used, improved interaction. John himself went on CNBC and said, I've met more people in the last 6 months than in 30 years in Anderson, and it's transformed the way we do business, and it became a global trend setting. However, Anderson Consulting were really pissed off because they couldn't have the holding company look more innovative than Anderson Consulting. So they brought us on board to say, well, we can take this one step further because we know our consultants are out and about. So help us create a distributed real estate model and implement it. So between 1998 and 2002, we took those early ideas I showed from the 90s and implemented them. This is what their real estate portfolio looked like when we started. And within that timeline, this is what it became. So the large metro centers, which were high cost city center, became this very small, iconic buildings with lots of touchdown environments where they were needed, delivery centers in India, and increased remote working around the world. Over a period of another 10 years beyond that, we then went on with Accenture at that time, because it had changed its name, to deliver a real high-performance workplace where we drove up the engagement scores and the group work, which were their drivers, reduced the cost of real estate, and significantly reduced their carbon footprint. So back to that balanced scorecard idea and measurement. This work for Anderson and Accenture was instrumental in our ability to deliver how we could support global corporates. And it gave our data credibility and our tools credibility. So one of the first big global implementations we did, taking all of our tools in play, was for Microsoft. In 2004, Microsoft were struggling in that in Puget Sound, where they had all of their engineering groups, people felt that the buildings were no longer inspiring. They had acquired Xbox, and the Xbox engineers said they would not go near Puget Sound because it was soul destroying. So something had to change. And we needed to understand how Microsoft works. So we did this comprehensive engagement study around the world. And on the back of it, we developed, between 2004 and 2009, this iterative workplace research platform for them, where they can begin to support their teams to define the appropriate solutions, to standardize the way they could evaluate, and to do POEs to assess how well the space was performing. What's really been exciting for me to see is how this transformation has panned out. And just to show you the timeline, when Microsoft moved to Redmond before it went public, Bill Gates actually used his father's law firm to kick the firm off. And that's where the whole notion of engineers in enclosed rooms came from, because they found they could concentrate. So the campus was developed with individual rooms. When we first put in Workplace Advantage, we rolled it out in Amsterdam, which was a sales environment. The engineers still said, not us. By 2009, they were already looking at engineering space. And I was in Seattle last week, and it is now being rolled out across the Redmond campus. What's even more exciting from a DEGW legacy point of view is that David Craig and Michael Chappell, who were originally involved in this, who are now at Gensler, are still supporting Microsoft on this journey. Georgia Collings, who is now at CBRE, is still doing the change management. So the same DEGW team is actually continuing that transformation journey. Corporates were a big part of our work, but not the only part. Government transformation was significant for DEGW. And we spent over 25 years working across the UK government, across the US government, with the GSA, and beginning to transform the way their workplaces were responsive. And John last year showed Working Without Walls and Working Beyond Walls as seminal reports for the government, which they were. And of course, one of the big elements around those was that they could deliver 1.5 billion savings per annum by actually creating a flexible workplace strategy. The government is taking that live at the moment, and AECOM is working with the GPU hubs, looking at mixed-use, multi-departmental agile working. And ironically, Rob Harris and I are actually doing a review of the hubs for the BCO. So we're kind of working on both sides of the equation. But what I think is more interesting about the government work, rather than just the transformation and cost savings, was another side of what that transformation meant. And in this slide, there's an awful lot of information about cost savings. This was for the DCSF in London in 2008. But I think the most interesting piece of data is that this project delivered a 50% greater sense of energy in the London estate. And that was hugely important in being able to attract a new type of caliber of people in government, and also to change the relationship between government and the constituency around it. Similarly, in Singapore, again the same year for the Prime Minister's office, we looked at how we can take the Reduce Waste initiative and, rather than drive down space per person, undertake a massive change management exercise that would allow them to implement flexible ways of working, some home working, more face time, across the government estate in Singapore. And Sue Lim, at that time, I think, undertook change programs across every department in the Singapore government. So very pervasive role with government. I said earlier that it's been a very difficult story to pull together, because it's not just about places of work, it's about places of learning, it's about culture, and it's about urbanism. And I've tried to sort of pick a few examples of each in this, and I'm sure I'm going to miss a huge amount in the story. But I do think that the work done around the transformation of learning was critical, because it informed the workplace work and vice versa. So creating spaces to support pedagogy and looking at how the learning landscape also had the same type of characteristics, whether it be the distribution of specialized, generics, and much more informal spaces, in the same way that workplace environments, was really, really critical to understand. And what we began to see were all the issues that I was talking about earlier regarding circulation, regarding space types, being driven around human interaction, playing exactly the same way into the learning world. And Andrew Harrison, who led a lot of that work in his recent book with Les Hutton, maps out the virtual learning environment and how that begins to move across education, workplace, culture, leisure, and living. That was very much the thinking around the brief that we did for the British Library in 2008 about how we can create a digital center for the British Library that would transform the integration of those things. But culture and city become really important parts of this. And one of the most important projects for us was the whole evolution of the South Bank Center, which started in the 80s. And I love this slide that Steve Smith sent me because he and Frank, this is one of Frank's, I think, last workshops, client workshops, facilitating that user engagement in exactly the same way and with the same level of evidence, and layering the experiences in the space. And Steve is still working with the South Bank today in the same way that we do in those work environments. So what we're seeing is that blurring prediction that we had way in the early 90s very much coming to life today through the activities that technology allows us to deliver. Boy, I'm in the last section and the voice is really going. Theresa May is definitely, I'm channeling her. Right, so where do we go from here? I did this map because I thought there's some really interesting things. I've talked about a lot of the projects on here. But what I found really interesting is that the iPad and WeWork were launched the same year. And I think there's something really interesting in that, because both liberate us from workspace and our work. We can take it with us. We can do anything. And I think there's something really interesting that's happening in the workplace. If we think about the workplace, having started in the coffee houses of Vienna and Lloyd's in the city of London, I feel where we are today is that we are rediscovering the value of the social workplace. And we're doing it in a very unique way, because I think technology enablement has freed us up to reconnect with our humanity and to begin to look at what it is that we value in the places that we go to work, to learn, to live, and how we can be more fulfilled in them. And that image on the top right, which I haven't talked about, a recent project of ACOM's with Estee Lauder, where a lot of the emphasis is around that engagement and well-being. And one of the things that constantly strikes me is that this notion that space relates to how people work rather than where they are hierarchically is not a new idea. I mean, we at DEGW fell in love with it way back in the 70s with Central Behir. And Central Behir looks not really different to Google in 2009. And the DEGW office in 1989 in King's Cross doesn't look much different to the ACOM office in 2017. Those elements keep repeating themselves. And they're obvious. And the more I looked across these slides, it's almost like, yes, it's there and it's clear for us to understand. Yet, most workplaces don't reflect that. We still, the majority of workplaces in the world, are regimented spaces to support uninterrupted flow of work and visual supervision. And people still think that one size fits all, that not having choice and control is the answer, even though we know for a fact that desks are only used 50% of the time in those environments, and lo and behold, the people, 70% of them are disengaged and uninspired year after year. And we don't see this as a business driver. I do think, however, something's happening in the world which is forcing us to shift our perception. And what's happening is the cost of our lack of human performance and the cost of our well-being or lack of well-being. 1 in 3 workers in Europe are affected by workplace stress, and it costs the UK 9.9 million work days per year. It's in the 500+ billion, the cost in the US. And suddenly, we are starting to think about, could we not really think about the space driving human performance? How can we help people come out of this wellness paradigm where we feel actually we're okay because we're not ill, but we're not exploring what we could be if we achieved high levels of wellness. I think we're seeing a whole set of certification, the well building standards, a great example of that, policies, government policies, corporate policies that are starting to wake up and think about this. And what that means is a real transformation to the way decisions will be made. I don't personally believe it's really transformative from a DEGW point of view, but I do think the data we have today will make it transformational. Flexibility and convenience, leveraging time and location in an either-or way rather than just having choices, has been what we thought about it before. But actually, it doesn't need to be either working from home or in the office. We can have choices. And if we think about London, 83% of women and 80% of men are highly stressed commuting in London, more so than going to the doctor or financial worries. Well, that's pretty damning evidence. So the ability to distribute our time across multiple locations, which allows us, ironically, to reinvent neighborhood centers, regional centers in much more interesting ways, I think is absolutely one of the key elements. When we do choose to go somewhere to work, those places of work will be much more around active design to support functionality and comfort. Places to disconnect and to focus, and places to collaborate effectively. There is a 66% drop in performance when we're exposed to distracting noise, when we're trying to concentrate. So why wouldn't we want to support that? There's much more opportunities to have user control and input. We have come, and we will increasingly, to expect that in our homes we can control the light, we can control the temperature, we can control the conditions. So why can we not do it in the office? I think we will demand that we do it in the office. And I think what's interesting is that we're starting to see the furniture manufacturers going down that route. This image on the top left, by the way, I have to tell you, I love this. This is an engineering group at Arab who have 3D printed their own desks. And they're actually monitoring the environmental conditions around them. That, I think, is the future. It is about absolutely personal control and quality of the environment. 1/3 of employees' sick leave is attributed to poor indoor air quality. Surely we know enough about buildings to be able to create healthy environments for people. I think those people will demand it, so we will no longer have a choice. As they will demand being connected with nature. We've recognized for a long time that being exposed to nature, being in a garden, 79% of people feel much more relaxed when they're in a garden. Children heal faster in hospitals when they have view of the outdoors and light. Cisco in Berlin, in their innovation center, have actually built a tree house outside. And funny enough, I saw several tree houses being built on the Microsoft campus last week. So this notion that we should be embracing nature in a different way, whether it's through literally natural materials being exposed to nature or even lighting that supports the natural cycle. Circadian lighting improves sleeping patterns by something like 40%. So why wouldn't we want to embrace that in our buildings? But also connecting with each other in meaningful ways. Social well-being is critical today. And being able to connect with people at work is essential. People are 7 times more engaged if they have a friend at work. And the millennial generation would like their colleagues to be like their friends and family and live together practically. So I think it moves us into a whole different mindset. The ability to have convenient amenities and services that are actually really interesting, immersive, authentic, memorable, that give people joy and support their life at work. At 22 Bishopsgate, we are providing over 100,000 square feet of landlord amenity space that is uniquely designed to support different activities in a 1.4 million square foot building. Still, it is very unique. An occupier tenant would do it, but not a developer. So I think we're seeing a significant shift in this arena. So I think we're moving into an era of new performance metrics where we're going to be measuring the right things, decreasing useless space, wasted time, absenteeism, stress, outdated policies, and increasing choice, ideas, engagement, well-being, trust. All of those are going to play a significant role in our lives. And lo and behold, it's being done for us. Now, this is really scary. I said I was at Microsoft last week, and I saw something which absolutely blew me away because it brought together everything that we had done for Steelcase and for Microsoft, but actually pulled it together in a way that only a tech business could do, in the cloud, ambient, everywhere. How many of you have seen the new partnership between Steelcase and Microsoft? Nobody? Okay, look it up. They just launched it last week. And what they're doing is actually using Microsoft Cloud technology and Steelcase sensors. They can tell you real time exactly the utilization of your building, what's happening, who's doing what, how much they like it, because the sensors can actually sense your mood as well. What's more interesting is if you connect that to Microsoft Office 365, suddenly Steelcase and Microsoft can tell you who's collaborating with who, how effective that collaboration is, and it can re-engineer your entire business. So I think the future is in the value of data, but what it means is how do we begin to leverage design in a completely different way? And the other thing that completely made my mouth drop open last week was that I saw this diagram at Microsoft, but it wasn't this diagram. So this is a diagram Rob Harris and I developed a few months ago for 22 Bishopsgate, and we're developing further for the BCO productivity new guide, which is really going back to the DEGW ideas of looking at people, process, and place, and examining them through this Maslow pyramid of saying what is the basic need you need, which is flexibility in supporting business change, but ultimately purpose and values is around attracting and retaining people and having places that look and feel like great places of work. Well, ironically, the entire Microsoft business case is based on a model that looks exactly like that. So what it tells me is that the tech businesses that actually see the value of data are seeing space as the new frontier of innovation for them, because they see that space has an incredibly powerful role to play. So I'm going to end on what I think are some of the ideas from DEGW. I think I've made the point that I think most of them are still valid today. But I think fundamental to the business was this notion of embracing change, understanding that social issues and the context within which we're working is constantly changing. And therefore, we need to be responsive to it. But not as designers in isolation. We're not really the clever ones. I think we're clever when we co-create with our clients. When we learn and innovate alongside our clients, that's when new amazing things happen. So the value of design, I've said time and time again, must be measured against specific and concrete business objectives. And we must recognize that design is a very powerful means of accelerating cultural change. But the process is not just about architecture. It's about people, and therefore it must be managed appropriately. And above all, the process must be open-ended, iterative, collaborative, and creative. And I think that's where the role of what you're doing at Reading comes in and what the future of design is about. This is where we can come back and bring value to the data revolution, to the ambient awareness that we all live in today. So thank you very much, and first and foremost, thank you to the University of Reading for taking on the archive, and to Stuart Green, who's actually led this process. I think this idea of having a living archive, which Dr. Hiral Patel has been actively trying to make sure happens, is a very, very stimulating one. I want to thank Nicola Gillen and ACOM Strategy Plus, because a lot of the material from case studies are still copyrighted to ACOM, so thank you very much for letting us use them today. All the DEGW alumni, clients, and friends, many of whom I've left out, and many projects I've left out, so apologies, but thank you all. And finally, I think I want to thank Frank and John for giving me the opportunity to have the ride of my life for over 30 years of amazing, constantly evolving change. So thank you very much. So I did, okay. So tonight we have a response from Sir Stuart Lipton, but unfortunately Stuart's in Japan. So I think Hiral was pleased about that, because she got the opportunity to interview him for about an hour or so on working with DEGW. So we had a lovely session with him. And we've extracted, or I don't think I've seen it, but we've extracted a short clip, thank you, that's the word, of Stuart telling us what he thinks about working with DEGW.
What do we do in life? Why do we go to work? On one hand, we have to earn sufficient monies to maintain our lifestyle. But on the other, hopefully, we're stimulated, we're thought-provoked, we enjoy what we do. We try and enjoy our relationships, our families. And so it's very important to think of lifestyle and work style in one place. We've had all sorts of ideas, most of which have come and gone, whereas Frank's ideas and John at Stockley, and then I think Despina around the mid-80s, have all stayed. They are really consistently moving. As very, very few are original. There are a lot of reproductions, but we want originals. That's what Despina is. I don't know anybody doing the work that Despina is doing. And I'm lucky people ring me up and they have ideas, but I find very little new. So I'm waiting for another turn of this world. So one of the things that's always interesting with Despina is going to see people that either we know or we think are interesting. It's continually interesting that they have new ways of using their time. So what I find most interesting is how daily life has become more and more involved in the workplace. I think in interpreting the work of DEGW, we should look at social issues first, ask questions, not just talk about the science. But the future will not be the past. And every cycle of life has a cycle of architecture.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'll save the formal thanks until after the questions and answers. What an inspirational lecture this has been. We will be putting the full video recording of the interview with Sir Stuart on the website. It's just going through the final editing, so that's something to look forward to. And again, that's very much part of our vision of making the archive a living archive that engages with people in practice now and in the future. John describes himself as part of that living archive. We've got a little bit of time now for questions and answers. Please give me a wave. It's good, please, if you can say who you are and the organisation you represent. But if you're a student, don't let that put you off, okay? I'll be disappointed if we don't get questions from our students in the audience. So please, who would like to go first? Yes, please. In the front row here. We've got roving mics.
Thanks. I'm Chris Burt. I'm absolutely thrilled, Despina, to meet you because I'm working at Microsoft and I'm got a completely new role at Microsoft. My responsibility is about people and places with that goal of engagement. And I honestly didn't know what I was coming here for today, but I've got responsibility for the customer service and support sites across EMEA. And one of the challenges that we've got is different working practices that are American-based, where life and work and family are merged, and European countries where there's legislation that prevents that merging. I'm just kind of interested in your views as to how place and people and work in Europe versus Americas.
A very interesting question. I think it goes back actually to the foundation of DEGW, because when the firm started, and IBM at that time thought that everyone around Europe worked like the Americans did, they very quickly realized that was not the case. And that was what led to us setting up our European offices and understanding much more what the local cultural characteristics were. I think there are elements of work process in organizations, in global organizations, that tend to be consistent across different divisions. But the actual day-to-day implementation of that process varies along local culture dramatically. And you need to be able to customize those solutions to reflect that local culture. I remember years ago in Spain, when we were doing time utilization, we used to see these enormous dips because everyone went out for lunch, and that was the culture. If you do time utilization and look at work patterns in India, people like to eat together. So when some of those people come to work in their own companies here, they cannot understand why someone would sit at their desk and eat a sandwich, because it breaks down the whole social cohesion that they come to expect. So I think you need to understand those two layers. You need to understand the consistent elements, which are typically about 70%, but you need to respect the 30% that's very local to the culture and context.
Who's next, please? Yes, please, on the front row.
Adrian Burton from DEGW. I talked earlier. Do you think in the future, as offices become more about collaboration, that actually there'll be offices without any desks at all, that people do their working at home will come to work to collaborate? Do you see the office?
I think that's really interesting. We had a client many, many years ago for Toshiba Corporation, Ufo Mori, who actually had this concept that in the future, the office would be a garden. And you would all come together to this garden and just be together and collaborate together. I don't think it's unrealistic. I think it's important to understand what the tasks are that we do. And some people concentrate better around people than others. So I think we need to recognize that we're each unique. And therefore, I think we might always find some elements that might be like desks, but not necessarily used in the way that we see desks used today.
Next question, please. In the front row again, and I'll come to you afterwards. Thank you.
This is the tricky questions crowd on this side, I can see.
James Maddock, Cushman & Wakefield. There's been we hear a lot of commentary around the millennials, Generation Z, etc. In fact, I got told off the other day by a millennial for calling them a millennial, as if they were some sort of different group of out of beings. From your perspective, do you think that is that the new groups of people coming into the workforce, are they any particularly different from any other groups of people, or are they just more native IT savvy than the rest of us?
Well, I think they definitely are more IT savvy. So therefore, they have different expectations of communication and knowledge sharing. But I showed the slide of the 4 generations very specifically because the research that Rob and I did a couple of years ago in the city was really fascinating, because when we looked across those 4 generations, we found that, yes, whilst there are differences, there are some very consistent sets of expectations. And if we can design to the consistent sets of expectations, similarly, like the question about the different cultures, we can balance those differences and allow those to happen quite naturally. So I think there is definitely a demand for flexibility that cuts across everyone today. And it's driven by a variety of issues. And definitely a greater focus on knowledge and knowledge sharing and growing in your role, and a focus on well-being. People want to know that their employer actually is concerned about them. So I think those 3 elements will completely transform the demand and the supply of workplaces.
Thanks. Hi, Rob Harris. That was great. Thank you. If I could pick up the back end of what you were saying about the future, because a lot of what you said was about clients and the Googles going into their buildings, their organizations, understanding what they're about. But we're getting very close now to having smart buildings, and then soon after that, smart neighborhoods. And so we really either got to have then a transformational impact on work and life. The problem with that, of course, is the stakeholder group is amorphous. It's planners, it's architects, it's a huge range of people. Yeah. So how are we going to change our agenda, if you like, our approach to capture that much broader school of thinking and get something?
I think that's a really interesting, it's a kind of bigger societal point. And I love again, going back to DEGW's approach of thinking of the various elements of value. Because I think one of the things that we're going to find is the more we drown in data, the more we're going to need to be discerning about what questions we ask of that data. And the questions we ask will need to go back to what is the value that they actually deliver, whether it's a value to society, whether it's a value to the individual or the enterprise. And I think some of those will be aligned, but some will be very conflicting. So I think being able to layer the way we look at data and look at the outputs of that data is going to be critical to making the right decisions, to educating those different stakeholders who come from a hugely diverse set of expectations and timelines.
Okay, a question on this side, Professor Robert Van Noort, directly.
It's been a wonderful story. So I work here in the university. I have a bit of oversight over buildings and capital investment. The last bastion of the cellular office must be the academic. The whole identity is bound up by that office. How do I get them to embrace a modern working space?
Oh, well. Now I'm going to bounce that ball because we've got the expert right here. So Andrew Harrison, who's written the book on learning environments, would you like to answer that question?
It is the hardest challenge to make, and that there is this. It's the last place where there is a direct correlation between space and status. And so the way I try to approach it generally is around many of the issues that the speakers talked about collaboration and interaction, and also about the words that are in every university strategic plan about industry engagement and all of those. They say, well, actually, we need to create spaces where industry feels comfortable as well as academia. You want to co-create. You need to co-create in a landscape where everyone's happy. And then to think about the office as part of this wider network of spaces that they can occupy. I still get shouted at a lot, but at least moves it through. And then the only way to do it is to try it, to pilot it, and to test it, and measure it, and then occasionally you'll get through. But I am doing an institution at the moment where it's my biggest ever academic office. It's 450 square meters for a single office. So,
Excellent.
That says a new high for me. But we are seeing change in many locations that people are realising it's not economically sustainable, but it's also not encouraging the sets of behaviours that universities need to adopt for themselves and their students.
So in a way, you're kind of shifting it to a different economic reality. And what I always like to think is you've got to understand what's in it for them, right? Unless you can answer that, you can't. So your industry point is really interesting because that's what brings funding.
Although one of life's ironies is that if I was to predict a faculty, I'll probably get into trouble for this, that is most conservative about the relationship between space and status, it's business schools. And you'd think that would be the extreme opposite.
Very interesting.
There's much more of a status concern there than I find elsewhere.
Thank you for the question, Robert. I would have been disappointed had you not. Please, we've got time for just a couple more questions. And not the front row here, please.
Hi, Amy Thomas, Delft University of Technology. Thank you very much, Despina. That was fantastic. I had a question about what you were talking about concerning technology and the increased mobility enabling us to re-engage with our humanity. The question I have is, one thing I find personally is that having this on me all the time is actually increasing my stress levels at home. So the ability to take work away from the office is perhaps having a negative impact on people's well-being and stress. And I wonder if you're seeing any trends away from technology, if you're seeing people actually, a kind of rebuttal of this in any way.
So that's a really interesting point. And I think it's probably a little bit of a generational point as well, because I think the younger people are, the more they see those devices as an intricate part of their being. And maybe this is a very personal thing, but I've always seen technology as my choice, not everybody else's choice to reach me. It's my choice to reach them. And that changes the dynamic, because what happens is then you can begin to compartmentalize when you access it and what you do with it. And I do see a huge pushback on technology in that sense. I do think people are starting to focus more on spaces where they can have no technology, they can recharge, they can reconnect with their mind, their body, their spirit in different ways. And I think this is where we're seeing a lot of the issues around nature. You don't actually want to be in a forest and be looking at your iPhone, right? You want to feel the experience. And I think this issue around immersive experiences that connect us to who we are as human beings is a fantastic design opportunity. And it's really going to take, I think, a lot of policy, design, and behavioral change to manage that tension that you so well described.
Probably one last question, please.
Oh, really? Now we're really into the tricky ones.
Steve Smith from Open Narrative. A lot of what you've talked about is related specifically to very large organizations, global corporations, etc. I wonder if you had any insights about how do you think small businesses will work?
I think that's really interesting, because I think large organizations are desperate to behave like small businesses. So what they are trying to achieve is actually that sense of community, belonging, sharing, and knowledge that exists in startups and small businesses, which is why you're seeing big enterprises like Cisco or Microsoft or Barclays go and set up in a little touchdowns office environment so they can feel like they are small businesses. So why do I say that? I think that a lot of the things that I talked about ease of knowledge, sharing, collaboration, sense of belonging, exist naturally in small businesses. I certainly felt at DEGW when I first joined, we definitely had this incredible sense of community because we were 40 people and we all knew what we were doing. By the time we became 250 people, that dynamic changed. And I certainly felt connected in some ways by traveling all the time, but I was disconnected. So I think there's great lessons to be learned from small businesses, and the reverse of that is how we can help small businesses to preserve those great attributes that naturally exist within them.
Okay, thank you. I think that's an excellent note to end on. Despina, thank you for an excellent talk. It's been inspiring, I think. Space is so central to organisational life, and too often space is seen as a cost. I think what you've done tonight is you've cemented our understanding about space being viewed through the lens of value. We hear very little of the kinds of arguments that you make. Okay, as I tour the corridors of the professions, as I talk to people in organisations, organisational theory is too often blind to the creative synergies that are available from a more innovative use of space. Architectural practices seldomly think about understanding the organisation before they embark upon design. And other built environment professionals are all too often focused entirely on the efficiency of delivery without very much caring about the benefits to the end user and to the organisation. Into that mix you've added social change, you've added technology, and I think I will invite the audience to show our appreciation of a fantastic lecture. Thank you.